There was a phone call from a guy named Chuck Comiskey who was getting ready to do, or was involved with a Roger Corman movie called Battle Beyond the Stars. I'm not sure who the contact was. Somehow I think Jim Cameron was talking to John, and he saw fit to bring John through to the stage where we had this big complicated setup going. Now, if you look through the camera, you saw the entire set as a completed shot. A big giant ship in the foreground, troopers in the middle ground, weapons being unloaded, crates, equipment. You saw part of the maze. You saw the star field overhead and the ship landing in the distance, all in camera. So John Carpenter took a look through there, and he was, I think, pretty impressed. He mentioned it later in the press in some of the interviews that was something that really he saw the potential of what could be done. Working with the Corman effects facility. So partially on that basis, we got the contract to do the effects for Escape from New York. One of the things that was a challenge was this few of the shots of flying in toward New York at night, with all the city basically being dead, with very few lights, just a scattering of lights here and there, street lights. And so I felt that a miniature, a small-scale miniature, probably worked pretty well for that, but we had very little money. So the first thing I got a hold of was a map of Manhattan, and I got an overhead projector and projected it up on the wall and made a tracing on a large sheet of paper of all the streets and the whole lower Manhattan area. And that became the basics of our layout for that miniature, that fly-in shot toward toward Manhattan over the water. Basically it was my brother Dennis, myself, a guy named Steve Caldwell, and I think Tom Campbell, who was sort of becoming studio manager there. And it was 4 or 5 of us had something like 10 days to make this whole thing. And very little money for materials, so it seemed like cardboard. So it became cardboard and Xeroxes. We went and took photographs of buildings in Los Angeles that looked like older style buildings, brick buildings and things like you'd see in New York. Matched as closely as we could to photographs we had of that area in New York, so we could get characteristic windows, etc. We had set up a darkroom in one of the rooms there, and so we enlarged sort of like a wallpaper treatment of a number of different window patterns, meaning where we multiplied and cut and paste to make sort of like sheets of windows. Then Xerox those in different degrees of light and dark. This was the least expensive way we thought we could make this thing. And then hand colored them basically with colored pencils, and because they were not color photographs. We didn't even have the option of color photographs. But being as these buildings were basically muted browns and sort of rust colors and grays, it would work fine. So that's how those buildings were made, and these were probably the largest one were about the size of an average cereal box, and they were a top, 2 sides, and a front. I mean, the backs were open, and we glued little wood blocks and little kit bashing pieces to look like air conditioning units and piping on the rooftops, and it was really the sheer volume of pieces buildings that we made that actually made it work. There was a lot of detail, none of which held up if you looked at it very closely, but for a moving shot from the perspective we were at in the air, flying over it, worked pretty well. There were 3 models, 3 gliders that were made. There was I don't know if it was a 3rd scale. Gene Rizzardi, I think, worked on that. He was hired in at New World to make the largest of the gliders. Then there was a resin one. I believe it was made out of resin that was maybe wingtip to wingtip, about 2 feet. And that one was mounted and shot motion control. And then we needed a very small one for a couple of perspective shots. We had one that was, I think a guy named Brian Chin made it, and I worked on it. It was maybe a 6-inch wingspan. we had a view that was God's point of view, looking directly down on one of the World Trade Center buildings, where you see the building vanishing into a little point. But sitting on the rooftop, teetering on the very edge of it, is this glider. So, well, I had the idea, let's just make a photograph and just build the roof, set it, just because we're looking directly down on it, let's make a three-dimensional roof for it. So we made a rooftop maybe this big, set it right on the photograph, and put that little plane model there and just teetered it with a tungsten wire, a 001 tungsten wire. So that basically is just a photograph with looking down on a photograph. So the things we had to watch out for in this pre-Photoshop days is that you have to do a lot of photo paste up and cutting. So the biggest problem was hiding the shadows of the edges of the photographs, and also trying to hide the shadow of the wingtip from a photograph that was maybe half of an inch below from showing. So we had to be very careful on how we could teeter-totter this thing and shine a little light in there to fill the shadow in, so that it didn't show up as a shadow, but also didn't show up as a light spot either. So simple effect, but dodgy in actually trying to do it, but very inexpensive. But that was the whole thing with that film, is trying to find ways to maximize the amount of money we had. As there were some fairly ambitious things in it. I was actually one thing is that was one film this has happened a few times where my credit, I think, was as third string matte painter, so I did some of the matte work on it, but I was actually one of the unit supervisors, and there was a mistake made in the credits. So there you go. And it was one of the runners up for visual effects that year. They I don't think it stood much chance of getting it, but the competition was pretty stiff. But Bob Kaiser, who was the overall supervisor, the editor, went and made the pitch for it at the Academy. It was a fun project. We were working with Cameron. He was doing very ambitious things, and we all were, for that matter. So we try to help each other out as much as we can, and sometimes butted heads, but that's the creative process.